Okay, whenever you're ready.
We covered ZBest, the fraud, headed by Barry Minko. As she said, I will cover the intro. I'll kind of open up the case to you, identify some key players, show you how they got started up. Troy will come in and kind of open up the fraud, kind of explain to you how they did it, what they did. Blake will then explain to you the auditor's role, what they didn't do, what they should have done. And then I'll come in and kind of wrap it up, how they ended up, how the downfall happened, and where they are today. First of all, we have a video for you. It's just kind of their commercial.
Terrific Tommy's here. We're going to clean your carpets.
How much?
How much?
How much?
How much you got?
Hi, we're the carpet cleaning twins. I'm Bink.
I'm Switch.
You want to know about our 2-for-1 offer? You're tired of going through the same problems every time you want your carpets cleaned. It's time you called us. I'm Barry Minko, president of ZBest Carpet Cleaning. We clean carpets with such care, I'll guarantee the work and our price in writing.
ZBest, the last word in carpet cleaning.
Some of the key players, obviously Barry Minko would be the main guy here. That was the guy in the commercial. And when they started out, he was young. He started the company at 16. He was very manipulative. People trusted him. People wanted to believe him. People thought it. Some people would call him the Wonder Boy because he did all this at such a young age. Another key player would be Tom Paget. This was kind of his wingman. He was the owner-operator of Interstate Appraisal Services, which was basically a company that appraised, but wasn't really a company to be all together. And you'll learn more about that later on. Another key player was Ernst & Winnie. That was their auditor throughout most of the case, except for that beginning, was Greenspan. He was the sole practitioner, auditor. He was involved at the very beginning. He committed some wrong at the very beginning, but wasn't too involved later on. And then the last key player who wasn't a super major role, but Mark Morris, he was kind of their copy machine. He made over 10,000 fraudulent documents for them, which kind of helped them continue this. There's a picture of Barry right there, and there's a picture of the copy machine. How they started. At the age of 12, his mother was a telephone solicitor for a carpet cleaning business, which is kind of how he got familiar with the carpet cleaning industry. And then 4 years later, out of his parents' garage, he started ZBest. It was located in Reseda, California. He was just 16 years old, like I said. And to get into the carpet cleaning business, it really didn't take a lot. You didn't need a lot of licensing. There wasn't all the requirements. You didn't need much startup capital to get involved in it, which is why he was able to do it at 16. And when he first started the business, as a young kid, you're looking for money. You want more money. And in the business, he really didn't get a whole lot of profits. So in the beginning, he had little profits. He was 16, and he wanted to grow. But he went to these banks and they wouldn't loan him. Who would loan a 16-year-old kid making marginal profits a whole lot of money that he was asking for? So he had a lot of troubles with that and just business overall. He got a lot of complaints. He did this and that, and he struggled in the beginning, which is why he wanted to go public so bad. And in December of 1986, he went public on the NASDAQ. And when he went public, he lost control of what he could disclose. On the financial statements, he had to disclose this, he had to disclose that, which kind of made him cover up his tracks a little more, and he had to kind of hide some things and do it a little more efficiently. When he went public, he gained a lot more attention from the SEC and its investors, just because his financial statements were out there now. He had to disclose them, and some of it was good, some of it was bad. He was still a 16-year-old guy who started his own business and he went public with it. and when he went public, he pretty much became a multi-millionaire overnight. But he looked the part, he acted the part, and which is why most of the people didn't look past it, didn't look into it, and which is why he was so successful in the beginning after going public. And as in year, by spring, their stock exceeded 100 million, which is why they looked so successful. He owned a red Ferrari, he had a mansion, he was living life, and everyone thought he was because he worked hard. Yeah, this is where Tori will take over, covering the fraud.
Okay, so as Nate was saying, Barry had a shortage of working capital. And this was due in large part because he was so young and also because his carpet cleaning business was only marginally profitable. So the banks refused to loan him. So instead of getting money from the bank, he found other ways to get money. He did things such as check kiting, credit card forgery, staging of thefts, stealing from his grandma, and eventually the insurance restoration contracts. So check kiting, according to the text, refers to manipulations that utilize temporarily overstated bank balances to conceal a cash shortage or meet short-term cash needs. So basically, it's falsely inflating the balance of one checking account to allow written checks to clear that would have otherwise bounced. Credit card forgeries are using someone else's credit card to charge purchases or withdraw funds. Eventually, Barry opened a merchant's account at a local bank, which allowed him to accept credit card purchases and also to withdraw funds. So this allowed him to charge customers' accounts whenever he needed the money. And if a customer would complain about the false charges on his account, then he would apologize, blame it on crooked employees, and for the most part, he would make their accounts right. Also, he used staging of theft, so he would basically have a friend or an employee come to his business and act like they were burglarizing it, just so that he would get the insurance proceeds from that. And as far as I know, he would get whatever items were stolen back, so really he was just profiting from the insurance part of it. As I mentioned, he would also steal. He borrowed $2,000 from his grandma in the beginning, and then obviously that wasn't enough, so he went back and stole some of her jewelry and also sold that. And then he also forged $13,000 of money orders from a liquor store. Okay, so the insurance restoration contracts were the biggest part of his fraud. Barry and Tom Padgett formed Interstate Appraisal Services and also Assured Property Management, which they were a totally fake company. Nothing about this company was real. And initially it was just used to generate paper profits that he needed to get money for banks to loan him money. But he realized that really there was no need for his carpet cleaning business anymore, which was basically just a hassle, so instead they used this as a way to get money. Let's see. So yeah, basically were fictitious contracts from insurance companies to restore damaged buildings that had been burnt, flooded, etc. Just any way that the buildings were damaged. Like I said, this became their primary source of income. And a big way that they were able to do this was they had Mark Morris, who Nate mentioned earlier, was the copy machine. He basically could replicate any document as long as he had some sort of template, and as long as the auditors were okay with accepting a copy, not the original document, he could make anything look perfectly the same as what an original document would look. And then Tom Padgett was another huge key player. He was an insurance claims adjuster who confirmed the jobs. So if any third parties would call in question about whether these contracts were true or not, they would talk to Tom, and he would verify that they were real. And in exchange, Barry paid him $100 per week. So let's show you a short video.
Joe Dominic wrote a book about Barry Minko called Faking It in America. Dominic claimed that Minco's auditors had been satisfied with examining photostatic copies of original documents. Once Minco realized that, committing fraud seemed very simple. All he needed to succeed was the help of his two lieutenants, Tom Paget and Mark Moores.
Mark Moores was a master of the copy machine. He could play the copy machine like Horowitz played the piano, and he could essentially cut up anything and make anything. Go to the library, find the model, and make that. And through a series of copying and Xeroxing, he could make any document you wanted, essentially. And as long as it could be a copy, he could produce it. If you wanted an original, then there was a problem.
You take the checkbook of the phony setup company.
Okay, so ultimately what Barry Minco and his company were running was just a big Ponzi scheme. According to the text, the Ponzi scheme is a swindle in which a quick return on an initial investment is paid out of funds of new investors to lure the victims into bigger risks. Old investors were paid off with cash from new investors, and then the newest investors lose their investment because there's no actual appreciation of assets involved. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, all of the profits that ZZ Best reported were non-existent. The restoration contracts were totally fake, but despite this, the stock reached a market value of $220 million, and then 3 months later, the company was liquidated for only $62,000. So how they did it, that's the biggest question here. Minco was very manipulative, as Nate had said. So he was able to talk the auditors into a lot of things that maybe any other CEO wouldn't have been able to do. So he claimed that these sites, restoration sites, were confidential. So a lot of the time that this worked, and the auditors would just kind of shrug it off, but occasionally they really wanted to see that these buildings were being restored and that it was a true thing. So when that happened, he and his employees would do what they call sting operations, which basically they would find large buildings that were under construction. It didn't matter if they were really being restored, as long as there was some type of construction going on. And he, not Barry, but he would have two of his employees pose as leasing agents to get the keys to these buildings. Basically, they would convince the supervisor of these construction sites that they were the real estate agents, and that they were going to have somebody coming in that was thinking about renting the building in the future. So on top of that, once they got the keys, they would have people come in and they would place signs that said Z Best, so that it looked like they were really restoring the building. And they even paid the security officers to greet the auditors when they came in, so it seemed as if they knew they were coming and that everything was smooth. It was said that several $1 million were spent by Z Best to deceive the auditors. I think it was something like $4 million, which is huge. Arguably most important, the Z Best had both the auditors and its law firm sign confidentiality agreements, which basically disallowed contact with any third parties. So if the auditors wanted to confirm something, they basically signed away saying that they wouldn't contact anybody else. So here is a little snippet of the letter. It says, "We will not disclose the location of such building or any other information with respect to the project or building. And then also, we will not make any follow-up telephone calls to any contractors, insurance companies, the building owner, or other individuals involved in the restoration projects." Also, as Nate said, Minco was very manipulative, he was charismatic, he was a smooth talker, so he used that to his advantage. He made friends with the auditors, he would invite them over for dinner, he just did anything in his power to make them feel like they were his friends. And in a video, he even said that he made it a priority to also become friends with the auditors' wives, so that if the auditors decided that something fishy was going on with the Z-Best, that they would also have to go against their wives and saying that something was wrong. He also used leverage, of which I'll show a video here shortly. And he humbled himself and asked the auditors for help. So he made them feel like they were important and that maybe they were helping him make business decisions. And he did anything to distract them. So even if he really didn't want to ask questions, or he knew what he was going to do regardless of what the auditor said, he would ask these questions and ask them for help just so that they were thinking about what they could do to help him rather than what really was going on with the company. Sorry, we had this all embedded and then it kind of didn't want to work for us this morning.
Public accounting is a competitive business. Barry Minko knew that and used it to his advantage.
And so they're in competition with one another, and their competition is what you leverage. I can't remember how many times, Larry, I just know Coopers and Librarian would love this account. Does he want to go back to his clients and the manager and everybody and say that they lost the Z-Best account because they wanted to be petty? Because they set the ground rules and we abided by them? Do they want to lose the Z-Best account? No, they don't want to lose the Z-Best account. And I leverage that to the hilt too. So you got to remember something. Yes, you want to get to know your client. But you want to maintain your objectivity. And I believe the auditor's responsibility is to give up the $100,000 a year fee to prevent the $16 million fraud.
Okay, so as you can see, he's just in that video alone how manipulative he is. He talks really well. He's seemingly easy to believe in, even though in there he's sitting in his jail suit. Like he's really confident, and so it may be easy to see how the auditors could have been tricked or manipulated. So now Blake's going to talk to you about what the auditors did and what maybe they could have done differently.
All right, all the auditors, there are 3 different auditors for Z-Best. There's George Greenspan, who is the auditor of the 1985 or 1986 fiscal year, and Ernst & Winnie, who took over after him because people urged Barry Minko to get a Big 8 firm, so all of his financial statements look a lot more credible than one sole practitioner. And then Price Waterhouse took over after Ernst & Winnie, and they were only the auditors for about 2 months because the company collapsed and liquidated. So starting with George Greenspan, he was a sole practitioner of the audit in 1986. He was the only person, and he didn't really do a good job. He missed a lot of things. He insisted that he properly audited Minko's company, but he overlooked a lot of things. He said he looked at all key financial ratios, but in doing research, in 1985, they had 0 accounts receivable, and in 1986, on their books, they had 700,000 accounts receivable, and the revenues went up by like $3 million. And if he would have looked closer and obtained third-party documentation and other stuff, and actually looked at the sites, and then you probably would have seen that they don't have, all these revenues they're recording are not real, and they're fictitious. He claimed he audited in accordance with general accepted auditing standards, but he made no personal on-site inspections, and that's a huge red flag. He thought that what he did was totally sufficient, and when the congressman asked him, he said that he thought he did nothing wrong, and he relied on what these people were telling him. Everything that he was getting for the insurance confirmations, he just called Tom Padgett, and Tom Padgett would just tell him, hey, yeah, this is what, this is the right thing. But it turns out Tom Padgett was in cahoots with Barry Minko, and George Greenspan didn't do anything. He he didn't sign the confidentiality agreement. It didn't say anything about that like Ernst & Winnie did, where he could have gone after the third party and like tried to contact someone, but he did nothing. He relied on internal documents. And that was another red flag, that he did no third party confirmations. And next to Ernst & Winnie, Minco retained E&W after dismissing Greenspan because since he was going public, he needed to show everyone that he actually has a reputable auditor. And in terms of the engagement letter, E&W was hired on to 1, review of company's financial statements, 2, assist in the SEC registration, 3, submit a confrontation letter to ZBest underwriters, and 4, do a full scope of the audit for fiscal year April 1987. They did the first 3, but they never completed the 1987 audit, and because they resigned as the audit firm in June of 1987 after they received a letter from an anonymous source, and they got out of there and tried to make it seem like they didn't want anything to do with Barry Minco because they knew that everything was going to blow up. So what they did, they really distanced themselves and made sure that they weren't going to be liable for anything. So that's why they never issued an opinion and resigned. But them resigning also played into, it was bad because they did it in a shady way that later changed how the SEC requires companies to, the auditor changed documentation. The SEC ended up shortening the length because Ernst & Winnie took the maximum allotted time, and that caused investors and the public to not have an idea of what was going wrong. And according to Greenspan, Ernst & Winnie, they never contacted him. Ernst & Winnie claimed that he contacted them, or that they contacted him, but that's just up in the air about who's right in that. And that's another red flag, if they didn't contact him. And they signed the confidentiality agreements, like Tori said, with Barry Minco. And those confidentiality agreements, it should have been a huge red flag for them, just because it takes away the independence, and they're not going out to a third party to confirm everything. Instead, they relied solely on the internal documents that they were producing for them. And their head auditor, Larry Gray, failed to check building or construction permits. In the congressional hearing that he had, he told them that what he did was sufficient, and only the internal documents that they were providing sufficed. So he never went and checked the building or construction permits, never figured out if the building had an insurance claim. And another red flag. And the last thing, he failed to check if the insurance claims had been filed. So he went solely off of what Barry Minco and his employees were telling him. He didn't go out of his way to check anything, and that's mostly due to the confidentiality agreements that they signed, which they should have had more. What they should have done is stood their ground and not signed the confidentiality agreements. And even though they might have lost the client, but that should have been the huge red flag that would have just caused them to not get in a sticky situation. And the last auditor was Price Waterhouse. They became the auditors after E&W resigned, and they were only auditors for 2 months because the company liquidated and everything blew up. And E&W failed to disclose concerns about the financial statements, and E&W took the absolute longest time in to go against Barry Minko's 8K. Minko had to file an 8K for his company that was the reason for the change of auditor. And Minko didn't say that Ernst & Winnie changed because they had a complete disagreement with the entire financial statements and how shady they were. And then from AU 31607, we have a few things that Ernst & Winnie and all the other auditors should have noticed about that would be red flags of fraud. So management or other employees have an incentive or are under pressure. Minko needed to prove earnings because he was running a Ponzi scheme. So each year, the jump in revenues from like under $1 million to $4 million should have been the red flag. And another instance of fraud occurrence was the ability of management to override controls. The fact that the management got E&W to sign a confidentiality agreement was just reason for them to be skeptical of everything, and they're even skeptical when they visited the site. They did it on their own time instead of letting them know, and Minko just got lucky. He picked the right building to fake. And another one was those involved are able to rationalize committing a fraudulent act. And if you look at Minko, from everything that Tori and Nate have had, he is really shady. Everything he's done, whether it's the check kiting or every fraudulent action, he didn't care. He was just wanting to have fun. He wanted to live the rich lifestyle. And as Nate will tell later, to this day, he's not changed. And some of the auditor's responsibility, from AU 31629, in planning the audit, the auditor should perform analytical procedures relating to revenue with the objective of identifying unusual or unexpected relationships involving revenue account that may indicate a material misstatement. All the restoration contracts were with the same party, and that should raise concerns. And then the gross profit margins did not agree with the industry standards. So especially with Greenspan, since he is the reason that Ernst & Winnie kind of were able to, or that everything was able to progress, because he didn't find any problems in his first audit. And then the number of multi-million-dollar insurance contracts reported exceeded the nationwide available contracts. So even Barry Minko didn't even look and see oh wow, we probably shouldn't do this amount of insurance contracts, because it's clearly, they're doing insurance contracts in the Los Angeles area isn't, that number can't exceed the entire nation's. And some audit evidence, denial of access to record facilities, certain employees, customers, vendors, or others from whom audit evidence might be sought. E&W signing the confidentiality agreements should have alarmed their own auditors. Another red flag. And then the tips or complaints to the auditor about alleged fraud is another one from AU 316. E&W, they finally resigned on their own terms, but it was after that they confronted E&W, and then they received an anonymous letter that was like, hey, we should probably wake up and realize that everything that's going on here is fictitious. And that is a good thing, but the way they did it and took all the time they did to file the 8K and about the auditor, how the SEC wants the auditor, to talk, or how the company needs to file the 8K to talk about the auditor change. The only people who knew the real reasons for the auditor change were Minko and E&W, and no one went public about it until E&W went public at like the very last day they could have. So they caused a lot of investors and a lot of people to get duped because Barry Minko, in the time that the company was falling out, he would get investors to invest more. Like a personal friend invested $1 million, and completely lost it because Minko was doing a last-ditch effort to just get as much money as possible before it all blew up in his face. And now Nate will talk about the downfall of the company and what happened to a lot of the major players.
The downfall kind of occurred when, they gained a lot of attention, but there was a Los Angeles Times article published about Barry, and it kind of entailed just his earlier credit card forgeries from when the business first started and kind of all that, which kind of gave him some bad attention. And that led to some investors kind of, questioning his standing and kind of like made his stock price fall a little bit. So Barry got really panicked at this, and he actually made a press release very shortly after the article to kind of boost up his stock again, and it showed record profits, record revenues, and Ernst & Whitty saw this press release and was very upset with it, which is one of the reasons why they resigned. Also, a week earlier, they were sent a letter that said that some of their clients were involved in fraudulent activities and listed out a list of allegations, and then they stopped communicating with Ernst & Whitty, so they kind of let it go for a while, and then they discovered in Barry Minko's accounting records that he had canceled checks to this informant that they had, and so they were kind of alarmed by it, and they were really upset that because Barry had bribed them off with a check for $25,000, and they discovered that. And then, as Blake mentioned, then a week after they resigned, but before they announced it, they got an anonymous letter that listed out all the fraudulent activities that they believed Z-Best was involved in, which were pretty much spot on. And at that point, Ernst & Whitty knew that they made the right choice. What ultimately brought them down was the LA Times article, which was actually from a woman who was fraudulently charged way early from the credit card forgeries, and she had kept record of what had happened to her. She kept a diary of other people who had the same causes, and she was just not a Barry Minko fan. She didn't buy into any of this, and actually her diary was the basis for the LA Times article, which panicked Barry into making this press release. Also, towards the end, Ernst & Whitty and its investment banker kind of gave a little more credence to some of the allegations that were being said about Z-Best, and that kind of just gradually got worse and worse, and they finally gave it up. But ultimately, the big downfall was his press release, which made Ernst & Whitty resign and kind of gave them out the picture. The way everything settled out, Barry Minko was charged with 25 years in prison on 57 different counts of securities fraud. However, he did parole in 1995. He only served about 7 years. Tom Pageant, he was sentenced to 8 years, served a little less than that. Ernst & Whitty was actually in a big lawsuit with a large California bank. Since they issued a review report, they actually won the lawsuit and was not really charged in this case. And mainly because in the review report, they strictly said that they were not going to give an opinion on Z-Best, which kind of, in the end, kind of saved them. And so they were not found liable in that large California bank settlement. However, there was a shareholder lawsuit, which Ernst & Whinney was obviously part of it. It was them, their former law firm, and their investment banker. All of it was settled privately. They said that a total of $35 million was paid out. They didn't give really individual payouts. Where they are now, as I said, Barry Minko was paroled in 1995. He was paroled for good behavior, and they call it betterment of self. And while he was in prison, he got a master's and a bachelor's from Liberty University in religion. So after he got out, he actually married a friend of a former inmate that was also in a fraud. So they would kind of share stories. He published a book. He was even starting a movie. They were going to start a movie about him. But his main thing was 2 years after he paroled, he became a pastor. And a couple years later, he was actually the head of a large non-denominational church in San Diego. And also he started his own institute. It was called the Fraud Discovery Institute, and that was in 2001. And actually, there was another scandal that he was involved in because it was his company. He was sentenced to 5 years. And basically what happened, it was called Leonard Corp. And they were a very successful company, a building company. And I guess a friend of his was owed money from them. So I guess he made false allegations, false stories about their corruption and this and that, which made their market value plummet. And they about $600 million is what they went down, which was ultimately what he had to pay. Anyways, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for that. So while he was in prison on his large denominational church, the new head had to be involved, whatever. And while he was in prison, obviously he's in prison now, but while he was in prison, they discovered that while he was the head of that church, he was embezzling money. He was making loans to himself. And overall, he embezzled over $3 million from that church. He stole donations. And actually, he still has a large following from the church that actually still like him today. I guess that just goes to show how charismatic, how charming he was, I guess. But yeah, they haven't really settled the embezzlement, so they want to make him serve his years consecutively with this. But yeah, that's where he is. As for Ernst & Whinney, they actually, like a couple years later, they merged with Arthur Young. They formed Ernst & Young. They actually expanded. They went global. They have a global structure. They're located in over 50 countries. And actually went really well. And then in 2013, they kind of rebranded themselves, updated, and now they're known as EY. And they're actually one of the top firms in their industry. And as for ZBest, I mean, they liquidated all whatever assets they had, 62,000. Obviously, they didn't make a revival or anything. So that's the ZBest fraud. Are there any questions?
Good? Okay.
I'm sure there are. Darren, we'll start with you.